Are you concerned about church governance and its effect on our national life? Does poor church governance affect our national life? If these questions are important to you, Hesabika invites you to the Church Governance Dinner under the theme Justice, Governance, and the Church, with keynote speeches from eminent global leaders, Professor Mervyn King from South Africa, Dr. Michael Schluter from the UK, and our very own Principal Judge of the High Court, Honorable Justice Richard Mwongo. The highlight of the summit will be a panel discussion that will feature key national church leaders such as Bishop David Oginde, His Grace the Archbishop Jackson Ole Sapit, and Canon Peter Karanja. The session will be moderated by Yvonne Okwara, guiding the conversation on how the church can be exemplary in its leadership and particularly in governance, both in its ministry and its impact on national life. Hesabika, translating concern into action.
I want to invite my friend and senior counsel, Fred Ojiambo. Where are you sitting, Fred? Senior counsel Fred Ojiambo, to come and say a few remarks about Dr. Schluter, from their personal walk together and history, and invite him to come up and speak.
Dr. Michael Schluter, which is his title, is certainly one of the most sought-after speakers. The first time I heard Michael speak was when he and, at that time, Dr. Roy Clements started a session of speakers, or speakings, or readings, if you like, on the issue of the Christian faith and the Christian mind on all the isms of this world, capitalism, socialism, and all the other isms. It started at the Nairobi Baptist Church, but then they extended it as the Nairobi Baptist Church started a ministry in at the Kenyatta National Conference Center. Every Wednesday, there would be a time when we would meet for 1 hour. They would discuss the question, whatever question they had that day, for about 20 minutes, and then the congregation or those who attended would be allowed to ask questions. And it was amazing to see what God has done in this man. He went on to do other things, and he and I got involved in doing other things together. He might or might not tell you about them. But it is great to see that those are the things that make the difference between what happens and what ought to happen. And so I don't wish to tell you that Mike worked with the World Bank before he went on to do these other things in the Jubilee Center in the UK. And now, as you know, as Peter has already told you, is in entrepreneurial work. But I'd like him to come up here and to tell us a little more about what he does or doesn't do, as the case might be. So it's my joy and privilege indeed to ask my very good friend, Michael Schluter, to come and speak to us.
Kenya is now, according to Transparency International, the 159th most corrupt country in the world, out of a total of 175 that they analyze. 159 out of 175. You are almost the most corrupt country in the world. Congratulations. And yet, you are also one of the most Christian countries in the world. 80% of you call yourselves Christians. 10,000 students every year pour out of your Christian unions into the workforce. So I'm asking myself, how is this possible? How can this be true? And the Kenya I know and love, which goes back to 1965 when I first visited here, and where my mother was born and brought up and lived most of her life, over 2/3 of her life in this country. The country I know and love was never like this before. In 1960s, it was the Pearl of Africa. Everyone spoke about its fantastic governance. So how has it gone from where it was to where it is? And where is the solution now? Where is the solution now? And I believe it lies profoundly in the churches, and I want to share with you how I see this situation. So I think Kenya has a cancer. And the cancer is eating away at the bones. Or you might think of it as some ivy that is growing up a tree and strangling the growth of the tree so that it is now dying. And I think part of this lies in the institutions. Now, institutions are not organizations, they are the rules that govern the way that public life is organized. And the thing that I learned in Kenya, when I was in the churches in Kenya, the thing I learned was what I never learned in the West, what I never learned in Britain or when I was doing my PhD in America, is that Christianity impacts on public life, not just private life. It is about public life. God is concerned with public life, not just with private life. So take the ownership of land. Land influences the way people relate. And you have imported from the West a pattern of individual ownership of land, which goes against both your own traditions in Kenya, I believe, but also it goes against the biblical teaching on land in Leviticus chapter 25. There is an issue about whether individuals should have the right on their own in rural areas to buy and sell land. This is allowed in Leviticus on the basis of city-owned land, but not on the basis of rural land. Or take the issue of debt. The Bible speaks from one end to the other against debt, because debt is toxic for families, toxic for human relationships. It creates a balance of power in a relationship which the Bible regards as unhealthy. So whether you look at Exodus or Leviticus or Deuteronomy, whether you look in the Psalms or Ezekiel, whether you look in the teaching of Jesus and the parable of the talents, whether you look in Romans 13, wherever you look through the Bible, the teaching is always against debt. No debt. And if you get into debt, every 7th year, that debt should be cancelled. And the first 1,500 years of the Christian church, the church allowed no debt. Somehow, interest and debt has crept into the church's life through somebody I hugely admire for their theology, John Calvin, who seemed to open the door just a little tiny bit. I think the Roman Catholic Church abandoned interest, allowed interest from about 1854. But look at the history of the church on the issue of debt. And now think about debt in Kenya, national debt. You are a deeply, deeply indebted country. And I have to say that I don't think all the money that has come in from those foreign loans has actually reached their proper destination. That's the truth of the matter. But it isn't just national debt, it's corporate debt and personal debt, housing debt. There are other ways to finance houses without debt finance, through shared equity and so on. And also, we have companies that have been run for too long in the interest of shareholders, who are often absentee shareholders. They don't have any contact with the company. And yet a significant part of the profits is returned to those shareholders, and the company is run in the interest of the shareholders. Now, I must take off my hat. I must acknowledge the extraordinary work of Professor Mervyn King, who will, I hope, speak to you later this afternoon. He is tireless in the way he goes around the world, trying to teach an alternative understanding of companies and of corporate governance. He's been recently in Australia, he's about to go to Namibia, then he's going to get an honorary PhD in Melbourne, back in Australia, then he's on to Tokyo. He's all the time on airplanes. Why? Because he's so dedicated and committed to spread the message that companies are not just about shareholders. There are many other stakeholders as well. And Mervyn, I want to compliment you today for your message this morning, for the way you've given your life and your own freedom to pursue justice in this area of life. Thank you for what you do. But I hope you'll also forgive me if I raise a question in your current deep constitutional crisis as to whether you've really adopted a Western understanding of constitution and government around social contract and individual voting as being what it's all about. So you end up with a winner-takes-all constitution, which is now causing you such deep problems and distress and could even split the country. I'm sorry to say it, but the covenant concept of constitution, which was the basis on which the American colonies originally came together, where you make a covenant before God as a set of communities who promise to stay together, like in a marriage covenant, in a constitutional covenant. That whole covenantal concept of constitution should be, I believe, at the heart of your Kenyan life and constitution, and because it's been based on a Western model which actually doesn't fit easily in the African context, you are in deep problems. And my prayer, my deep prayer, is that you will not break up this country in this process, but that a solution will be found which will keep people together. But it's also a problem of the heart. And that goes back to, as I've mentioned this morning, for those who were there, the problem partly of schools, that the schooling system is based on competitive individualism. It's how can I beat you? How can my results be better than your results? So you compete all the way through school, and then people leave school and they compete in the office. They compete in life for more money, for more power, for more position compared to their neighbors. Because the whole spirit of cooperation and relationship was not taught in the school system. And in the churches, I fear again the missionaries, and I count myself as someone who came to this country with this very mindset, that salvation is about my individual personal relationship with God. And of course, that's true. It is. That is how I understand it. It is our relationship with God which is the foundation of our salvation. That is absolutely true. But it is so much more than that. The missionaries came and said, you are guilty. You, individually, you have sin. Yes, yes. You can be forgiven through Christ. Yes. And you can then go to heaven. Yes. I tick all the boxes, but Christianity is much more than that. Now, there are people in this room much more theologically educated than me. I would call myself a humble economist, if that was not an oxymoron, if that was not impossible. How can any economist be humble after all? But let me just remind you, great theologians in the room here, let me remind you that God is not a God by himself in eternity. Maybe the Muslims think of Allah like that, but we Christians do not think like that. There was Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Genesis 1:27 says, as you all know, let us make human beings in our image. Male and female created he them. There are men and women, that's the most fundamental human relationship. But it's about the relationship with God as well. Sin is a breakdown of relationship between God and humanity, and between men and women, and between many other neighbor relations. Righteousness means right relationships. Covenant is about a long-term, stable, committed relationship made before God. Jesus was the perfect relational person. And he redefined poverty as primarily not a shortage of money, but a shortage of relationship. It was Zacchaeus he went to see on the way to the cross, a wealthy man, but relationally a very poor man. The cross, the heart of our faith, is about reconciliation and forgiveness. This is relationship language. And the church is meant to be a relational community, not with superficial relationships, not about networking, but about making deep, challenging, accountable relationships with one another inside the church. And eternity is described by Jesus as a great banquet. We will have a banquet here later this evening, but the eternal banquet will be even better than a Hesabika banquet. But a banquet is about community. It's about conversation. It's about celebration, yes, but it's deeper than just that. It's about community and conversation. It's not me by myself on a cloud strumming a harp. This is the new creation where we have jobs to do, but it's about us being together with Christ in glory. So how can Kenya be changed by the church? Let me give you a few thoughts. We need to see the church, I believe, examining the biblical teaching on debt and campaigning against debt. We need to say to the government, we want a debt-free growth strategy. We don't want any more of these big foreign loans. We want to develop without debt to other countries, which will be repaid by our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. It's unfair on the younger generation to take on that debt. We want land ownership outside the cities to be within the context of the community, within the context of the ethnic group even, where land cannot be bought and sold on an individualistic basis. We want schools that are based on a relational ethos, where people are examined, children are examined not just for their technical skills, their knowledge of math, science, and language, but for their relational skills, where they learn those relational skills in schools. And we want time to come under public scrutiny. Time is our scarcest resource. Not money, but time. And that's what Sundays is all about. It's by preserving our time for God and for our families. And yet work invades our time, shopping invades our time. We as Christians make other people work for our convenience. So these shop workers are dragged into work because we as Christians cannot be bothered to organize ourselves enough not to need to shop on a Sunday. Of course there are sometimes emergencies. Of course there are sometimes we have to travel and buy petrol. I know those things. But just as a community of Christians, don't we need to go back to that Sunday principle that has been at the heart of the faith since its beginning? Now, when I look at some of the great issues of the past, you find that the people who tackled them were Christians backed by the church. So take Wilberforce, his great campaign against slavery. You dig into that. Not every person who backed Wilberforce was a Christian, but let me tell you, it was the churches who were the heart of that campaign against slavery. That is what the history books show, if you look into it more carefully. And churches also were behind the big reforms of Shaftesbury, where he limited working hours in factories for children. You might think they were still far too many, but they were working 14 hours a day from the age of 7 or 8. It was a great Christian leader, Shaftesbury, who started to limit all of that kind of working of children. In my own time, I've been privileged to run a campaign in Britain called the Keep Sunday Special campaign. It was against Mrs. Thatcher when she was Prime Minister of Britain, and I think it was the only bill that she ever lost in Parliament. But it was because the churches decided this was wrong, that they wanted Sunday to remain a special day. They wanted a balance between work and rest. It was because they decided that in Britain that they campaigned against the British government. And the first interest group or coalition of interest groups in 100 years defeated a government bill. When churches get moving, the politicians have to watch out, because the churches can mobilize people, but it depends on the leadership of the churches recognizing that public responsibility. Now, there is a catch, and the catch is this, that we in the churches cannot point the finger at the politicians and say, no debt, and say, we need time for our families, and we want relationships to be taught in our schools, and we want relationships to govern the ownership and distribution and buying and selling of land. We want that relationship context to govern everything in our public life. We cannot point the finger when there are 3 fingers pointing back at us, and the politicians say, well, what about relationships in your churches? If you think relationships are so important, what are you doing in your churches to put them right? What kind of relationships do we have in our churches? And I think that is an enormous challenge. And let me just speak for a few moments on that before I finish. A friend of mine went to a church in Oxford, and he said that day they read Colossians 3:13, which says, be forbearing with one another and forgiving of one another. So forbearing means that you don't get irritated with somebody. And forgiving means that if they do you wrong, personally or as a group, you forgive them. And he said, I looked around this church. It was quite a large church by British standards, about 500 people. And he said to himself, he said, I think we must be a most wonderful church, because there's nobody in this church I find irritating, and there's nobody I haven't forgiven in this church. This man was a pastor. And then he said, I had a terrible thought. And the thought was this: there is nobody I know well enough in this church that I need to forgive them, or that I could find them irritating. In the church, we just say, hello, how are you? And if your partner, your first person sitting next to you says, in Britain, they say, well, I lost my job last week. You say quickly, well, it was raining a lot during the week. Let's talk about the weather. It's what we don't do in Britain, where we don't know what to talk about. We always talk about the weather, but we don't engage with that person's unemployment. We don't say, well, can I help you pay your electricity bill? We don't share our money in the churches. We share everything in Britain except money. Because money is for me, right? Not for us. So there's a huge challenge in big churches as to how you create deep relationships. When I joined the church which I'm a member of now, the pastor said to me, you cannot join this church, you cannot be a member of it unless you join a house group. Where you meet in the middle of the week with maybe 8 or 10 people. If you're not prepared to do that, you may not join this church. And I said to him, but I'm important, I'm busy, I have so many things to do, you don't understand my life. He said, I'm sorry, that's the deal. We only want people who are prepared to give time to building deep personal relationships in our church. Otherwise, you may not be a member. So now I'm leading one of these house groups. First I joined, now I'm stuck with leading it. Although I have to say, I think my wife does a lot of the hard work. And isn't that true in so many areas of life? And then a third issue I must mention just very quickly is the issue of forgiveness. I worked in Rwanda after the genocide. I remember there was a meeting of the Council of the Churches, which we had convened in Kigali after the genocide. And I remember the leader of this council standing up to speak after the genocide, and he spoke powerfully against the Hutu. He ranted against the Hutu people for half an hour. And I spoke to the Anglican bishop over coffee. I said, how can the leader of the churches in Kigali speak with such bitterness against this other tribe in Kigali? And he looked at me and he said, this bishop said so wisely, he said, if your wife and 4 children had all been murdered by the Hutu, what would you be saying here today? How do you forgive people who have really wronged you? And yet Jesus makes it a condition of our faith that we forgive people who've wronged us. There's no other condition given in Jesus' teaching on the forgiveness and acceptance by God except this one. God will not forgive you if you do not forgive people who've wronged you. Now, those people may be within your own family. I confess, in my own family, somebody close to me had said something against my children, and for 10 years I did not forgive them for that. Do we forgive? Do we forgive other ethnic groups that we think have wronged us? In Britain, do we forgive immigrants? In Britain, we don't have a problem of ethnic groups, but what we do have is a problem of class. Our British problem is class, which you don't have in the same way here in Africa. But we have white middle-class churches, blue-collar churches, but it's very hard to find integrated churches. But the issue is forgiveness that I want to focus on. Think through your relatives. That's always the hardest place to forgive. Think through other ethnic groups. Think through other people who are neighbors or in your community. Think of people who've wronged you. And ask God to help you to forgive. It's very difficult to forgive one-off. It happens over a period of time. But in our churches, if there's no forgiveness among our church communities, we will never change the nation of Kenya. We won't. So my last point was to let you think about the issue of love. Love God and love your neighbor. On these two laws hangs the law and the prophets. And my great moment in Kenya of eureka, of understanding, of breakthrough in my thinking, came when I was meditating on that verse. Love God and love your neighbor. On these two laws hangs all the law and the prophets. And thinking to myself, I'm going down to the World Bank office in Dar es Salaam on Monday morning, and we're talking about compulsory villagization. What am I going to say to the guys? That the solution on compulsory villagization is love. If I said that, they'd think maybe I'd gone a little bit soft in the head. Maybe I was in flower power from California in the 1960s or something. But you see, all of public policy in the end is about relationships. It permeates everything. It permeates corporate governance. It governs the relationships in companies. It governs what happens in schools, in the criminal justice system, everywhere. Jesus said, "They will know you to be my disciples if you love one another." If love is about other person-centeredness. And Jesus also says, "As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." How was Jesus sent by the Father? Well, he lived with his disciples day by day and night by night. He was with them. He was close to them. There was no power structure between Jesus and the disciples. He washed their feet. Discipleship is not about position. It's not about power. It's about love and humility and all the things that I find difficult and which we all, I think, find challenging. So the call for the church at this critical moment in Kenya's history is surely to stand up and be counted, to be part of Hesabika, to be the force that drives change in this country, that finds the solution to the constitutional crisis through prayer and through commitment of searching for solutions, seeking changes in the way companies operate, changing the way things work in schools, encouraging people to spend time with their families, with their children, to put time into their relationships in their families and in their church communities, to develop deep, deep relationships in the churches where the relationship with your brothers and sisters in the church is as deep or even deeper, Jesus says, than the relationships in the family. So I commend this idea to you. I ask you to look at all the different websites you can find connected with the Jubilee Center in Cambridge. Sorry about the connection to Jubilee in Kenya, but there's no connection. Jubilee Center in Cambridge, Relational Schools, the Marriage Foundation, Relationships Foundation, ALIA, which is about job creation, Relational Thinking Network. And let us pray for one another. Please pray for me in the work I'm doing between North and South Korea. Let me pray for you in the constitutional crisis, and that God will root out the corruption in this country. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Honorable Justice Richard Mwongo.
I will start by saying that Christians in Kenya are the greatest threat to governance in Kenya. And that's a fact. And Michael alluded to it. I'll go as far as saying if you really don't think that good governance in Kenya can work, it's because we seriously don't want it to work in Kenya. We don't. And I'll tell you why. You know the blind man of Bethsaida wanted healing. He wanted to have sight. His only plea to Jesus was to please give me sight, so that he could see and have his mind opened up to see the wonders of creation around him, so that he could give glory to God. We are not willing to open up our minds, our moral consciousness, and to gain sight. Many of us actually don't want to see the truth about misgovernance, especially at a personal level, and the correlation between that with a national body politic. May Christ spit not on our eyes, but on our moral consciousness, on our spirits. So if you don't mind, you'll indulge me as I take us along on that statement that I made, that Christians are the greatest threat to good governance in Kenya. I define governance not so much as Professor King does. He's technical about it. I define it very much as the dictionaries would. So a manner or fact or function of giving leadership with authority, the ability to sway and control using a system or systems of governing in order to influence outcomes. And I define the church not so much as the buildings to which we go for prayer and fellowship, nor merely the organisms or organizations which are put together for that function of prayer. I don't mean the clergy and the ministers when I say church. I define the church as you and I, all those who confess Christ as Lord. Christians, wherever they worship, whatever they do, what Paul called the priesthood of believers. The Kenya National Census of 2009 is an official state record. It will remain a record for years and years and years after we've gone. In 2097, if there is a 2097, in 2196, if there is one, that record will be there, just as we find the record of the census taken in Numbers chapter 1 in Israel. Mike mentioned that Kenya's population is stated to be about 80% Christian. It is actually 84 under the 2009 census. In 2018, the demographic survey indicates that it is about 82.8, about 83%. That's in a population of 46 or 47.2 or 3 odd million Kenyans. And so here we are in 2010, passing this constitution that we passed, a majority of us being Christians that voted one way or the other, but with 84%, I think the largest numbers, given the population that was voting, were Christians. We expressed in it our religious leanings. We gave God, as Christians, prime place in our constitutional and national life. And it's really seen just in some examples in the preamble to the Constitution, which acknowledges the Almighty God, which acknowledges our ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity. At the end of the preamble, it says, God bless Kenya. We invoke the name of God again. Now, I know Mike says that our Constitution doesn't really have any substantive provisions that we would call Christian. We may differ on that at some later stage. We do have provisions that enable us to be or to practice whatever religion we choose. Article 8 says there shall be no state religion, so the state cannot impose a religion on us, neither can it prevent us from engaging in any religion. In the national anthem, which is also within the Constitution, we invoke the name of God again. And Article 32 speaks to freedom of conscience, religion, belief, and opinion. We will talk about what the principles in a while that are that we might call Christian principles that we find in our Constitution. But before we go there, let me take us back to why we Christians are this threat to governance. Here are some examples. And in some of these examples, I did observe people who are involved. Many were Christians. Many were Christian leaders. Some were elders in various churches. I'll talk about that. I was involved in a body called the Public Procurement Complaints Review and Appeals Board. Many of you may know that. I was the chair for 7 years. It was formed in 1999, just when the Treasury was transforming the financial aspects of the running of this nation. It was formed to deal with the problem of misprocurement. In other words, it was a well-known fact that there were thousands of little administrative guidelines on procurement, but nobody had the whole set. They were not anywhere in one place. Those who stayed longest in the ministries knew best what those regulations and provisions were, those administrative guidelines. So cartels had developed over the years which run procurement, public procurement. I'm talking about public procurement, where the money is. And those cartels, in collusion with state officers, minted millions of shillings. The first case I recall that I'm going to mention is one of a large insurance tender, which was challenged for misprocurement before our board. It was a very, very lucrative tender. So it was all over the newspapers when it was challenged. Mr. Christian, one of the 84%, a top officer of state, I will not say which church he belonged to, who I knew very well, he was very visibly connected with a particular church, had an interest in one of the insurance companies. In fact, the winner of the tender. He called me. I was the chair. He basically sought to direct me that that tender should be determined in their favor. I told him the law and the facts would determine the case. That's what we were there for. We annulled the tender. Again, it was in the newspapers. I lost some popularity with some of those government officials. Case number 2. I refrained from mentioning the actual cases because I could tell you the names of the individuals and the companies that were involved. I have all the material with me. But it is important not to egg on defamation. Another tender by one of the highest offices in the land was challenged. The board sitting over it found everything wrong with that tender. Mr. Christian, a state officer, and the minister in that ministry called me, and they kindly advised me that the board should understand the public policy behind that procurement. For us, as the board, it was a rotten procurement, so we overturned it. And again, the media went wild. We are talking about 2000, the year 2000, 1999-2000, when the former President Moi was in power, when it was difficult to speak except over your shoulder quietly. We expected to be removed from the board. Nothing happened. Another set of cases, this time from the Pending Bills Closing Committee, which I was a member of. That was a committee established by former President Kibaki in the NARC era. After NARC won its great victory in 2002, I don't know whether you went to Uhuru Park, I was there, and saw the tumult of what was happening in the minds and the feelings of Kenyans, the rejoicing that there was for those who went there, it was an incredible feeling just to be a Kenyan. Well, so this Pending Bills Closing Committee was appointed in 2005, 2 years after NARC came into power. Its purpose was to evaluate all pending bills which the government had not paid. Bills, not parliamentary bills, but claims for goods, works, and services done or rendered to the government and not paid. It was our work to evaluate it, or each of those bills. We came up with about 115 billion shillings worth of bills, which we evaluated. After inauguration of the Pending Bills Closing Committee, the Cabinet Committee on Anti-Corruption, and I think you know the names, many of them are members of your churches. They summoned us and told us that we advised the President to set this committee up because it is very important for us to move from the past, get away or get rid of all the rotten eggs, all the rotten things and procurements that had been done, and start afresh. They also told us, please do not bother yourselves with any bills that arise from 2002. Very interesting, because you know what happened after 2002. We went back to the good old days. We did not agree with them, and our chairman found us a very, very interesting way to get away from the Anti-Corruption Committee. Case one that I'll share was a road project. A company, I'll call it Alpha Construction, was awarded 2 road construction projects or contracts. Subsequent variations were awarded by Engineer Christian. You see, these are people like you and me. They are not people out there. They come to your church, they pay their tithes, and they do the things that you do. Engineer Christian, in the 2 projects, changed the original contract sum by margins well beyond those set out in the contracts. It was in complete disregard to the existing procurement regulations. So a contract of 399 million moves up to 1.02 billion. And the contract sum for the second road moved up from 183 million to 694 million. I'm sure Mike's World Bank was probably partnering with us, I say partnering, with us on that contract. Case number 2, K1 Construction Company. It's not a company that you know of, but you will see it in town because it's still there. It won a contract for construction of a sewage project. Project manager, Engineer Christian, again, is certified an amount of 518 million shillings as compensation to the contractor during a period when work was suspended, despite the fact that the contract had no suspension clause. The Pending Bills Committee declined to allow payment. Case number 3. This was in 2001. Mr. D. Christian, accounting officer in the Ministry of X, made payments to a company of 722 million shillings between September 2005 and 2006, even though the court had awarded an amount of 128 million shillings. The committee declined to allow payment and asked the Attorney General to reclaim or recover the money. Case number 4, a company claiming the amount of 5.9 billion shillings in respect of, I'll say this, Treasury B Annex. Do you know where that is? That space in between the CBS Treasury building, there's a car park there. It's still empty. A claim of 5.96 billion was raised before the Pending Bills Committee. There was no valid contract between the company and the client, Treasury, because the validity of any such contract rested on a clause that said, subject to availability of funds. No funds were ever availed. No contract. Please pay us 5.9 billion shillings. Pending bills declined to pay. These are examples of real cases I myself handled in these committees. I spoke recently, about a week ago, to the person who was the secretary of the pending bills. He told me the pending bills committee, despite the fact that we concluded our work in 2011, is still running quietly in the background because all the claimants who are not paid keep coming back to the ministries. Whenever there is a change in the ministry, new officers, the claims are brought back and they might be paid. So the Pending Bills Committee Secretariat is now there on a permanent basis. There are other such cases, not necessarily in construction or in public affairs, in the public domain. There is Mr. Christian, company secretary, who files altered returns for a company so that they can benefit themselves or benefit someone they know. Or Mr. Christian advocate, who wins a large amount of money in compensation, but keeps it in his account without letting the client know for 2 years or 3 years to earn interest. There's Miss Christian Mitumba Importer, whose every bail comes in, tucked in there with a little gift for the customs officer. There's Mr. Christian or Miss Christian Estate Agent. You and me, we sell land, don't we, all the time. We assist in selling a piece of land that we know has been grabbed, or is public land, or has no title, and so on and so forth. Why is the voice of the church and the Christian message quiet when these things are happening, with 84% of us being Christians? And I know you will say that most of us are nominal Christians. There's an argument there. Well, we are the salt and the light. We are all called to be the salt and the light, but if salt has lost its saltiness, what can be done to regain it? How can it be made salty again? We are the light of the world, but we hide our light under our bushel. If only we let our light shine before men so they could see our good works and give glory to our Father in heaven. When you look at the biblical principles of governance and leadership, and I'll just mention a few. Exodus 18, it talks about competent and able men, men of truth, or honest men who hate dishonest gain. Those are principles. Deuteronomy 1:13, we should choose wise men, full of understanding, known among the tribes. In other words, having good standing, repute, well known in their own sphere of influence. Acts 6:3, we choose men of good report, people full of the Spirit, empowered by God, empowered by wisdom, that is understanding, and people who are team players, 7 of them. In Titus 2, Paul gives us a whole slew of the kind of teaching that should be given to men, to women, to young men, to young women. Temperance, respect, self-control, faith or faithfulness, endurance, truth, reverence, purity, being exemplary models, integrity, being well-spoken. All these are principles which have been put in different words in the King Report. Our own Constitution contains these principles. Article 232, Article 10, Article 201 on public finance. 10 is on principles of national governance, where we find the whole question of public participation, transparency, accountability, integrity. We have a whole chapter 6 on leadership and integrity in the Constitution. All these, I would say, are borrowed from the Bible. So, Mike, the Bible has had an influence on our Constitution. Despite all these provisions, and despite being 84% Christians, what do we see? Even in the organized body of believers who come together as the holy nation, who fellowship as saints called and call themselves by his name. We see leaders who are Christians. We see leaders and Christians who are greedy and gluttonous. They maintain engorged bank accounts. We see leaders and Christians who behave as the matatu culture does, intent to get there first and to have the most, not intent on servanthood and gracious giving. We see leaders and Christians given to hypocrisy, ready to use every shortcut to gain, even ready to put up, even in our churches, fake projects in order to justify the use of money, which will in turn benefit us privately. We see leaders and Christians who seek the blessings and not the blesser, who want to be understood, not to understand. We see leaders and Christians who choose power and possessions over the presence of God and the persuasion of the Spirit. We see leaders and Christians who want to be influential, not to be magnets to Christ. We see leaders and Christians who want you to know who they are, not whose they are. Until those in the church are influenced by God's Spirit in all they do, the church will never influence the nation in what it does. I tell you, no amount of shouting, praise the Lord, or hallelujah, will influence governance until our lives are lived in obedience to Christ. Let's talk a little bit about nominal Christianity. So I come back to the 84%. And it's true, most are nominal Christians. But it's also true, as in Israel, the record shows that we are Christians. All of us, all 84% of us. And that will be proclaimed from every corner of the world when they read our record. What's the news that we see? We see, one, misappropriation of funds in the church, leadership wrangles, arguments and fights about control and power, control over property. It might be about money stolen directly or money used in fraudulent projects or purchases that have little real ministry value. These often lead to disagreements amongst church members. If you looked at the Sunday Nation of 21st of January, you saw the headline, "Leadership Wrangles Threaten to Tear the SDA Church Apart." And the story told there is about a fraudulent, or what is alleged to be a fraudulent, conduct of elections, so that it was skewed and delegates were beefed up in some areas to lock out others. You have recently read about the wrangles, which are in court, concerning the Methodist Church. I can't discuss that because it is currently in court. I can't also discuss the cases before me involving the PCEA and the Anglican churches. There's a case you've been reading in the papers about St. Teresa's Hospital. I won't discuss it, but there we are. Second, we see the lavish lifestyles, ostentatious lifestyles of many church leaders. Almost monthly you read in the press of these lifestyles of church leaders. Their lives are buttressed by the earnings of the church, the offerings of the flock, maybe even the tithes that are offered to God. This is easy to achieve in church because many church constitutions do not have provisions for member participation. They don't have provisions for engagement, transparency. I know of many churches who operate by the Spirit. That means that whatever the pastor says goes. That's the Spirit. Cannot be challenged. 3, we see grabbing of public land. It's a fact by churches. Just look at the Ndungu report, and you will not fail to see the extensive participation of churches, temples, mosques, and other faith institutions in the grabbing of public land. And it's true that those events occurred many years ago, but the church as an institution of faith, a temple of God's dwelling, keeper of the nation's conscience, has it ever considered holding a conference to repent and to make recompense for the losses arising from grabbing of public land? Has it? Never heard of it. If we were the salt and the light, we might have thought of something like that. Grabbing continues. You all know the piece of land around Westgate, which had been fenced not too long back, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. That was alleged to belong to a church. They had all these Maasai warriors defending against any intruders. It is riverine reserve land. It cannot be anything but that. We also see the absence of moral authority to require accountability. And that's because in our nominalism, we have no roots of faith, roots of obedience. If you have skeletons, Mr. Christian engineer, Mr. Christian advocate, Mr. Christian accountant, if you have skeletons in your cupboard, it's very unlikely that you will ask the church to remove its own. We see a lack or refusal of self-regulation, which has invited government regulation. Christianity Today reported on 20th May 2016 that one of Kenya's best chances at cracking down on rogue, what one might call rogue pastors, was stymied by the church. You will see that article in Christianity Today of 8th February 2018. You can Google it. I will not read the quotation. I have looked at the letter which was written by the Attorney General in connection with the regulation of churches. When the Attorney General issued a moratorium against the registration of new churches. This arose out of the Pastor Kanyari fiasco. I've also seen a letter written by the Registrar of Societies thereafter, seeking to clarify that the AG's office had no intention to limit the freedom of expression, because that is what the churches were complaining about. That letter seeks to explain that the objective of the rules was to ensure a legitimate foundation and sustainable development of the operation of the organizations to be registered was in place, and that the moratorium stopping the registration of churches and societies was in line with the AG's constitutional mandate. So some people filed a suit and went to court. They challenged the freedom of expression. They challenged the right of the Attorney General to issue a moratorium stopping registrations. They sought a reinstatement of registration. The case was dismissed by Justice Mativo in Nairobi. He held, I quote, "It has not been shown that the respondent, that is the government or the Attorney General, acted illegally. The respondent is vested with powers to make the decision in question. No abuse of such powers has been alleged or proved. It has not been shown that this power was not exercised as provided for under the law." And so it is now open game, and I think churches are planning to get under the umbrella of under some umbrella. Because what the rules, the societies, religious societies rules of 2015 were intended for was, amongst other things, to put churches under umbrella organizations, of course of their own choice, so that it could be easier to govern and regulate these churches. It seems to me that the government was acting in the persuasion of Paul. Paul says that we should be of one spirit, one mind, striving together for the gospel, to be like-minded, united, and of one accord. That's what he said, looking out for the interests of others. Maybe those umbrella organizations could do that, maybe not. But I think if the church were to self-regulate, there would be no need for the state to regulate us. 7, there has been a deafening silence of the church as a temple of good governance. I know that from time to time we hear statements. I think Canon Karanja issued a statement not too long ago about corruption. Mutava Musimi in 2012, when he was vying for the office of president, he said the church is losing its voice on governance issues. In fact, not is losing, he said it has lost its voice on issues pertaining to the country's governance and leadership. I feel that the voice of the church is not being felt, and the church should be in the front line of advocating for good leadership. He was speaking at St. Paul's ACK in Kiambu in the Sunday service. In March 2016, I think this is the reference to Canon Karanja, after the Kanyari fiasco, Reverend Karanja is quoted as saying, "Poor leadership and lack of accountability structures have been cited as key contributors to rampant cases of corruption among religious leaders. But not all churches and members of the clergy are corrupt, and that's a fact." He said on Wednesday that most churches in Kenya are well-structured and have good internal governance that advocates transparency and accountability, and it goes on and on. You can read about that in an article called "The Sin of Corruption" in the Daily Nation of March 30th, 2016. So clearly the church is facing serious credibility issues, and that has been going on for a substantive time. There are those who say that the problem in Kenya is that we don't have sufficient regulations or law to take care of the various things that go wrong. We don't have sufficient frameworks. We blame the matatu industry and the borders for traffic deaths and general disorder. For most things that go wrong, we easily blame inadequacy of the laws or regulations. But that's not the truth. When we were preparing Kenya's first statute on public procurement, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Assets Act of 1995, there was so much public distrust that the bill we were working on had to go through 23 editions with public participation. 23 editions, more than the Constitution of Kenya. One of the provisions required that tender committees must invite a member of the public to sit in there to see how the tenders are being conducted. The evaluations, tender evaluations are being conducted. It was that bad. 23 editions of a bill. And this is notwithstanding the fact that we had borrowed from the UNCITRAL model law on public procurement in coming up with our own Procurement Act. Between 2010, the new constitution, and 2017, we have had 161 new acts of parliament, new, entirely new statutes, over 185 pieces of subsidiary legislation. Surely we have enough law, we have enough regulation, we are probably over-regulated. Did you know that there was a Grass Fires Act? You can't just burn stuff in your compound or in somebody else's compound just like that. You have to give 2 days notice. Written notice. That's a Grass Fires Act which most of us breach every day. There's no shortage of regulatory frameworks. My last point is a plea It's a prayer. I think one of the key factors of good governance for a church is avoiding disputes in the public eye. In other words, not going to court. If your brother has something against you, you leave your gift at the altar. You go and sort it out with your brother, and then come back. If you don't reconcile, you know you'll be taken to the judge. We're talking about Matthew 5. If your brother sins against you, Matthew 18, don't gossip. Take him to the church for resolution. Matthew 6, 1-8 talks about disputes and resolution of Christian disputes. Do not take disputes to the ungodly for judgment. Instead, go to the saints. Is there no one among you wise enough to judge disputes among believers? The very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. That's Matthew chapter 6, verse 6. Around August last year, the Supreme Council of Muslims of Kenya was sued by groups of people, 3 groups of people in different parts of the country that felt disenfranchised by the elections that were being conducted in the local regions. And now the main election for the national body was going to be held, and a date had been set. They would not be able to participate because they had been locked out at the lower level. The matter came before me, and an injunction was sought against the holding of the national elections. I told them that this was a dispute amongst brothers, that as a religious dispute, it could be resolved in-house. There were protestations, mostly by the lawyers. Fortunately, there were members of the SUPKEM who were actually inside the room. And I insisted and spoke to them directly and told them that I think you can resolve this matter. They finally agreed to resolve the matter out of court. We sat on 3 different occasions. I did not arbitrate or mediate, but I was there to record whatever was being said. And a settlement was reached in 3 sittings, which we recorded in court. And we saved lots of time. And I count that as one of the cases I have completed. It is not in my backlog. Those Muslims seated in that room, they blessed me, a Christian. They wished me good health, long life. You know how they do it. They were extremely pleased. All that is captured. I currently record all the proceedings in my court in an audio system. I've looked at the constitutions of a number of churches. Many have in-house disciplinary provisions and clauses, including NCCK. I looked at yours. I looked at Nairobi Baptist. I looked at the Methodist Church. I looked at a number of them. Most have in-house disciplinary issues, resolution processes. But what if it's not disciplinary? It's a dispute on interpretation of the Constitution, on interpretation of something that's being done by the church that they don't agree with. Is that a disciplinary issue? A difference of opinion? The Constitution of Kenya, Article 159(2), requires the courts to promote alternative dispute resolution, including conciliation, mediation, arbitration. And you now know very well, it's very much in the public domain right now, that we are encouraging very, very actively. In fact, we have begun a court-annexed mediation process. We are doing it here in Nairobi in the commercial and family divisions. We have a new task force that was appointed early this year that is now beginning the work of rolling out court-annexed mediation throughout the country. The Constitution itself promotes this. Who are we to say no as judges? If you file your suit, we screen it and we fork it out to mediation if it is an appropriate type of case for mediation. I have not seen the churches clamoring at the courts and saying, we have this provision, please, can we come in and do mediation? I haven't seen that. Others are doing it. I'm not sure that there are many churches that have, on account of the new provisions of Article 159, adopted a clause on arbitration. Arbitration is final and binding. It is enforced by the court. Mediation, if it results in a settlement, can be final and binding. It will be enforced by the court. We don't have any of these. Instead, we are out there not being exemplary in governance, but washing our linen out in public. My prayer is that churches will consider this to be a serious governance point or factor. When you write your annual report at the end of every year, and when your auditor writes his report, why doesn't he put a provision in there about how many suits were filed in the church or against the church? How many are still pending? How many have been resolved by alternative dispute resolution? ADR, alternative dispute resolution, creates relationships. It preserves relationships, what Mike was speaking about. And that's why the scriptures command that we don't go to the judges to resolve our disputes. The church, I think, must wake up to its God-given place in the governance of itself and in the governance of the nation. Thank you very much.
Panel discussion that will feature key national church leaders such as Bishop David Oginde, His Grace the Archbishop Jackson Ole Sapit, and Canon Peter Karanja. The session will be moderated by Yvonne Okwara, guiding the conversation on how the church can be exemplary in its leadership and particularly in governance, both in its ministry and its impact on national life.
And of course, this will be a great conversation. We will try and keep it quite succinct, to the point. So I think what has been said the entire day might be a fact, that the church no longer has influence on national life. Canon, because yours is a membership organization, what sort of challenges have you faced with regulation? You know, the Attorney General is saying what he is saying, and I will quote what he said to the media in his moratorium that was actually referred to by the Honorable Justice Mongo, that he said this was necessitated by several reports indicating the officials of several religious institutions and societies orchestrating certain unconscionable activities that left their congregants at a disadvantage. So the church is saying, we don't want outside regulation, but what sort of regulation is happening internally? Or what sort of challenges are you facing with regulation amongst the membership of the NCCK?
Thank you. First, the church really hasn't said it is allergic to regulation. And the comment that was quoted from me said most churches have actually internal structures and mechanisms for their own governance and internal regulation within denominations, and they don't create a problem for anyone. But there are a few independents, single congregation churches run by perceived highly charismatic people who have very strong grips on their followers. And one of the things we said, you don't deal with deviation by tying down everyone. You should focus the problem accurately and deal with it. And what I would say is that this is work in progress. There is discussion within the church and consultation with government, and a mechanism should be found eventually that speaks to the need that is there. And it's not a matter to be populist about, but to look at very keenly and authentically. If you ask the challenges that we have within NCCK, we really wouldn't say that we have a problem. The bulk of our churches have pretty good structures that they live by. Some of the independents who may be a bit weak in structure, NCCK has a whole structure called capacity building for membership that quietly, without fanfare, works with our member churches in the areas of difficulty. Is it a constitution they need to craft? Is it a constitution they need to amend and revise to meet their needs? Is it how they should manage their leadership transitions? And this is being done programmatically as a way of life, and many churches have benefited. You could say the same about the Evangelical Alliance. These rogue preachers are not under any authority, and we must find a way to rein them in eventually without stifling ministry.
Well, but just takes just one rogue preacher who may or may not be a member of the Evangelical Alliance, or may not be a member of NCCK, and it brings it all down. So what do we do about those others who might not be members, of that? Because everybody looks to you, leadership, and says, do something.
Now, obviously, as General Secretary of NCCK, people who are not a part of our structure are not under my oversight in any way. I think the guidance we try to give is, if a religious leader does what is considered to be criminal, and some things border on crime, the law of the land is applicable. And nobody is above the law, particularly if they're involved in the conduct of public affairs. And to the extent that the law is violated, people should be held to account. The church has never been without one or two rogue fellows right from the start. You remember Judas Iscariot was amongst the 12, first generation. But the church continues to journey and carry out its work, notwithstanding the occasional difficulties that may arise. But Yvonne, this is something that we must grapple with and deal with and get a solution for. Thank you.
Bishop Oginda, is there no way to bring these rogue members in? Say something about it, make a statement. I know Canon is saying there's a lot of work that's done quietly, but perhaps that is part of the problem, that the public just does not know of this work that is being done to strengthen governance within the churches. So where do we go from here, Bishop?
The Constitution provides for freedom of worship. And so anybody, and freedom of association. So anybody can organize themselves in the way they want to without reference to any other person. So really, just from a practical point of view, if today I go out and start a church, and those who believe in my leadership come and join me, and we begin to organize ourselves in a particular way, he has no right to come and tell me I can't organize myself that way. So it becomes very difficult for any particular umbrella body to come and purport to bring control over any person who is running their independent church. And that's why, as Canon has said, we have said that where there are violations of the law, there is the law of the land. And actually the Bible rightly says in the book of Romans that the governor or government is there to ensure that everybody follows the law. In fact, the Bible says the governor does not hold the sword in vain. In other words, any person who is involved in criminality has ceased to be under the freedoms that are provided for. But any umbrella body cannot go out there and draw members and say, you cannot do this and you cannot do that. Sometime back in the mid-90s, we tried to put together an equivalent of what is in the US, which is called an accountability kind of body, which would be a free will. You know, you come and join in, and when you join in, then there are certain parameters that you have to operate by. And how it works in the US is that it gives you certain privileges, for example, in raising funds, getting tax exempt, and things like that. And therefore, it helps people to want to join. If the government were to set up those kinds of privileges, and they say that only these kinds of people who are abide by these kind of rules and practices can enjoy some of the privileges that have been there in the church that have since been withdrawn, I think it would encourage many, many church leaders to try and get into a place where they can be oversighted by other people. That I see may be the only way.
All right, and I'll come back to that in a moment, because across the board we're saying some of those who are rogue are not our members. And therefore what they do out there, there's not much control. Let's just put a pause there, because I'll come back to that. Archbishop Sapit, you had talked about boundaries. There seemed to be very little boundary between religious leaders, church leaders, and politicians, and persons of very questionable character, that at several of the churches, politicians stand on the pulpit and make political statements that they're in fact the major benefactors of churches, giving large sums of donations. Do you agree that there has been that boundary between the church and the persons you are supposed to hold accountable may have been blurred at some point, and that leads to the lack of faith, with ordinary Kenyans?
Indeed, as you say, those boundaries are becoming thinner and thinner, and the church is one place that is free for everybody to enter. And therefore you cannot wake up one day and say, so and so cannot come to this church.
Well, Archbishop, they can definitely come to church.
Yes.
But do they have to be on the pulpit, on your very holy pulpit, and make political statements?
Not on the pulpit.
I mean, they can come and pray.
Not on the pulpit. I'm saying the church is open for everybody to come in. And the church has to guard her pulpit, because people who are supposed to preach are people who are ordained, people who have been church and given that mandate by the church. Not anybody just walk into the pulpit and preach. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not denying the fact that you go to every church, and particularly if we can just be all blunt to ourselves, in the political environment, for example, for this country, the churches becomes the most popular places for politicians to come in. And they will want to come and say something. And I even invited, before even they say we want to say something, by us, the leaders of the churches, to come and greet the people. And in that form of greeting, statements are made which ought not to have been made in church. And therefore I think this is an area that the church must own up and say, we have done what is not supposed to be done. In cases that somebody has been given an opportunity to use a church podium to do things that are not of church. Sometimes ago, politicians will come, but they used not to speak even inside the church. Yeah. They will go out of the door and make greet people there and make whatever statement they want to make there. So that's why I was saying, as we went by, I don't know where, these boundaries has collapsed.
All right.
And so I began by owning up that so many boundaries have collapsed.
Have collapsed. Archbishop, allow me to put you on the spot. Is there a moratorium within the Anglican Church now to not allow politicians on the podium?
Actually, during
or is this something that you can commit here?
During the last...
that we can all hold you accountable.
During the last campaign period, I think I was on record saying we should stop politicians from making political on the podium of the church or even inside the churches. And I followed a statement also said by a Catholic bishop in Embu. I don't know whether you remember that week. And I think it is a commitment that we need to ask ourselves. Should we be opening the church to be the place where accusations are threaded or where political statements are made? Or should we allow worshippers to come to the churches and worship? After worshiping, then we go out and they will be able to say to whatever they want to say, what they want to say outside.
All right. I think we will all hold you to account to that one. Remember, I do a show on Sundays, and that is always the day when politicians have been going to church. So I will be sure, if one Sunday I read a bulletin and say, politician XYZ was at particular Anglican church this one, I will be sure, and I know how to reach you. I will be sure to make sure that we remind you of this commitment here today.
What I'm saying is that we have a system as the Anglican Church,
Yeah.
but we also have dioceses that are autonomous, and bishops.
Here we go.
I'm speaking reality, that you can wake up tomorrow and you have somebody in Mombasa or wherever with a politician in charge. But what I'm saying is...
That's an interesting question. Then are there consequences? I mean, I know the structure of how it works,
yes.
But are there consequences? And maybe Canon Karanja can talk about this. What are the consequences for members that go against your articles, that go against the rules, that go against what has been set up? I mean, do we see certain persons being expelled from the membership of the NCCK? What happens then?
I think Schluter gave us a statement that some people may have missed when he began his remarks. The church rises or falls on the local church. It really is the engine of the health and the life of the church, presided over by a priest or a minister in a very local community setting. Now, the politicians are members of the churches. They will tell you about when they were baptized, when they were confirmed, and their mother was an elder. Correctly. I think rather than being overly judgmental, I think the task we have is to appreciate that the ordinary clergyman in the village may not understand and have the skills of managing the situations when the politicians come. Because I've been to local church settings, the politicians come, the priest stands and says, I'll give you a chance to greet the congregation. I will stand here and not sit down when you're doing that. There are things that are off limits.
Canon, why does he have to greet the congregation? I have never been asked to greet the congregation at Valley Road.
Now,
and I like to think I'm as senior as they come, but my point is this. I mean, the village pastor, like you say, may not know these things, but isn't that the role of the leadership of the church, of the archbishop, of Canon Karanja, to sit down with that village pastor who has 5 people in his congregation, 100 people, 1,000,000 people, and to say, this is a code we have agreed to live by? Because so far what I'm hearing from here tonight is it's difficult, it's not us, it's the government, it's the ones who are not members. I'm not hearing a lot of ownership of saying this is what we can do as leaders here.
I'm not passing blame, Yvonne. I'm saying this priest may need some empowerment. The bishop, the person that supervises them, has a responsibility to understand the dynamics and be able to guide and hold to account his local pastors as they carry out their work. The politicians are ours. If they keep within the bounds, there is no reason to treat them as though they are excommunicated. Actually, they do need spiritual support that ought to be taken into account by the leaders of the church. So I would say we find how to solve problems where they are identified without throwing out people, but without allowing the church to be abused by anyone. This is an area where the church, I would say, has not succeeded very much. I think part of the challenge is some of the priests actually support some of the politicians. Some of them are their relatives. Some of them may be in their political parties. Occasionally, a priest may actually desire to give advantage to one politician rather than the other. So this whole subject of empowerment, I think, is critical. Part of it is spiritual discipline. Part of it is pure administration. It's a thing that we shall be on for a long time.
And so how do you plan to empower them?
The primary responsibility of the empowerment of the clergy is primarily by the head of the church and those that they share oversight with. At NCCK and in the fraternal groups, we may add some impetus on that. But if you consider the number of clergy that are in this country and the congregations that meet, really, their structures have a responsibility to create the kind of protocols required that can be shared. And NCCK and EAK can support the denominations in that journey, but someone must take the responsibility.
How? Because I'm looking for tangible solutions tonight.
Good question. How can it be done? I said earlier that one of the strategies we have at NCCK is capacity building for membership, where we target member churches and work with them in their organizational development and in their issues. And we have numerous fora where we interact with them and pass good practices messages that may not be on the media. They don't want to have everything in the media.
Why not?
So we know how to do it.
I need to earn a living. Might be good to have some of these. All right, thank you, Canon. Bishop, financial probity and accountability is one of the big ones that is there in terms of how much money the church receives, the tithe, where it goes, the paying for prayer phenomenon, the planting a seed, or as many people know, it's pandambegu. And many people, I think that perhaps would be the start of the disconnect, because the person that gives the most is the one who becomes the deacon or in the church elders. We know this, right? I mean, this happens. So let's talk about financial probity and accountability within the church for all the monies that are received, where they go, and how this then affects the credibility of the church to even speak to government and say, why are we taking another Eurobond in this country when the church itself doesn't seem to be quite open when it comes to its books?
Thank you, Yvonne. Maybe before I answer that, I just wanted to make a comment on the previous question. Differing slightly from what you seemed to be pushing, because politicians are actually leaders in society. And when a leader in society, according to the word of God, we give respect to whom respect is due, and honor to whom honor is due. That's what the Bible guides, how the Bible guides us to treat leaders that are in society. And for example, in our own context, the guidelines that we have given to our pastors is that there are 2 or 3 ways in which a politician could come into a service. There are those politicians who attend regularly, are members of the church. We don't give them when they come in, they may have been away for 3 months, they come back, we don't give them any special recognition because they are members of the congregation. There may be a political leader who just walks in on that particular day. They are not regular attendants. They did not give us notice that they are coming. We did not invite them for any special occasion. You acknowledge them because they are leaders in society, and the congregation is aware that so-and-so is around. So from the pulpit, you could say, congregation, we are privileged today to have so-and-so with us in the congregation. Mheshimiwa so-and-so, we thank you for joining us for worship today. And it ends there. There are people you cannot ignore. For example, the president comes, or the deputy president comes, or a leader of opposition joins you for worship. Those are significant leaders in society that will cause a stir among the congregation. In fact, if you ignore them, they will not listen, the congregation will not listen to your sermon, because they will be wondering, how can pastor continue as if nothing has happened, and Honorable Raila is right here with us, or deputy president is here, or the president is with here. So the congregation themselves expect that you'll give that person due respect and due honor. And beyond that, allow them to say something, because they are not here with us every day. Some of these people have never seen this person at close quarters. So if you ignore that, you yourself are failing in your duty. So how you manage that situation is very important, so that you give honor to whom honor is due without causing commotion, but with also not inviting them. So normally what I would do, I would say, today we are privileged to have His Excellency, the Deputy President or the Leader of Opposition visiting with us. We will give him a chance to just greet the people, but not to make any political statements. And that we normally say. So when this person
do they listen to you?
Most cases they
Good.
do. Most cases they do.
So at least you have some influence
Yes.
in that respect. That's
but
good.
there are people who we invite. Like just last Sunday, we had a function. Is it last Sunday or the other Sunday? We had a function in our Thika town branch, which is a new congregation. And the pastor there took liberty to invite the governor, deputy governor, and so on. They were actually invited by the church. So you can't invite them and then not give them a chance. So those are our visitors, those are our guests. So we treat them in that way as our guests. We give them opportunity to say something. Again, we remind them this is not an opportunity for campaign or politicking. And so far, I would say, in our own context, we have not found a situation where those opportunities are abused. But I just thought I could give that kind of example of how we handle that. But coming to money, money is a big deal. Canon Karanja mentioned Judas, who was in the 12. I think the accountability in church and how the money is used is part of our key responsibilities as a Christian community. And every church really owes it to account. Jesus himself says that we are going to give an account. He gives example of a man who gave talents to his workers. And when he came back, he asked them to account. What did you do with the talents that I gave you? And they gave an account. So as church leaders, we need to set systems in place where on a regular basis, we give an account to our members. This is how much money we received. This is how we utilized it. And it is also, according to the Societies Act, it's required actually for you to give an account to your members and to have your books audited. So I think it is just good practice that we have our books audited, we give an account to our members, we let them know how much money we collected in the year, how much, where we spent it, what we spent it on, and allow them to question our activities. Why did you spend so much money on this? Why did you ignore this area? And for example, in our own AGMs, members have the liberty to ask any question, not just on money, but on how we govern ourselves. I think it is part of good governance practice.
Public participation is a big one, and we're right now in the formulation of the budget, the national budget of this country. To what extent, Archbishop Sapit, is public participation allowed within the Anglican Church, not just after, which is how the money was spent, but rather before, in how they want the money to be spent?
In the Anglican Church, we have a quite elaborate system. Most dioceses have their financial management system. We have at the provincial level, where we engage people in budget-making processes. And how budgets are arrived at the diocesan level is stemming from the grassroots, which is the parishes, discussing about what they want to spend on their money as they collect from the local churches, and that stems upward to the national level. And therefore, they do participate using the parish councils or the local church councils, and they all have an AGM where they come and discuss next year's budget as well as receive this year's financial accountability systems. At the national level, we demand that every diocese submit their audited accounts. And therefore, we have audited accounts of various dioceses. And therefore, I think for the Anglican Church of Kenya, just say for, say, a few errands or somebody who is not careful about their work, but systems are there, and we ensure that participation is right from the local church coming upward.
And that may be a little different within the NCCK, right? Because, the Anglican Church is one body and they have their dioceses. But what happens within the NCCK in terms of that? What sort of financial probity standards do you require of the membership of NCCK?
The Anglican Church is a member of NCCK and one of the larger ones. Every member church is a body corporate under the law with their own internal instruments and structures. And we encourage them to follow the good practices in their own structures because that is their right and their responsibility. We don't ask that they submit accounts to us because we do not have that kind of accountability responsibility. But if we find that they are breaking the boundaries, as it were, we have a discipline mechanism that enables us to hold them to account. At NCCK, as a body corporate, we have our own structures, a finance and admin committee that is responsible for the budget and its implementation and auditing of accounts. And our executive committee is the governing organ that passes all decisions related to finances. I think it's an effort that is being made within churches. Our experience is that the churches that are transparent, that let their members know what they are doing with the money, tend to find increases in their revenues very substantially because of the confidence that they build. The ones that are opaque and find it difficult to declare all the things that go on in relation to finances, they tend to be pretty limited in the kind of revenues that they make. And so you want to tell churches, it is in their interest to be absolutely transparent because that is what inspires the confidence that is necessary for the members to give generously and faithfully for the work.
So what would happen if Archbishop Sapit fails to be accountable because the Anglican Church is a member of NCCK? As a body corporate, which is the NCCK, what sort of leverage do you have, for example, with government to say, these are our members, and these are the standards we have set by which we will live, and therefore to make yours the one-stop shop for government to say, when we want to speak to the churches, we'll go to NCCK, we'll go to the Evangelical Alliance of Kenya, because the denominations are as many as the sand in the sea.
We don't have a supervisory authority over the churches.
Do you think you should?
Discipline within the churches must be internal, essentially. And that's what I think the judge was saying. They have their own constitutions. They have their own instruments. They really must be able to follow them. And if there are disputes, they should be able to resolve them. At NCCK, we really haven't found situations where there are churches that have to be reined in because they are reckless and careless. Overall, they have good practices. And in our organizational development support, we work with them, not from a condemnation perspective, but a working alongside support. And some of them have good testimony. I'm sure EAK has its own journey and experience. Yeah.
So from what I'm hearing, things are very good within the Anglican Church. Within NCCK, there's quite a bit of structure. Your members, more or less, toe the line. The Evangelical Alliance of Kenya, everything is well. Within CITAM, everything is well. So why are we here today? I mean, it's good, isn't it? Why would we ask the great Professor Mervyn King here today? I think why is Dr. Schluter here today? So where is the problem? We are fine, aren't we? The church speaks with authority on matters in national life. The church can speak to matters of corruption, to matters of moral values, to chapter 6 of ethics and integrity. The church is the one that can today command all of the political leaders to the negotiating table, and they will come. That's what we're saying. We're great, aren't we? We're good, yeah?
I think maybe you missed it a bit.
Remind me, please.
I think what we are saying here is that we tend to generalize. Like, say, when the Kanyari saga came up, everybody was like, this is what the church is doing. The church is playing tricks on people. The church is fleecing people. The church... That was one person, not even one church, one person who is doing things in ways that may not be acceptable. Some may even actually be criminal. So we as the leaders of the church, we said, let government deal with that situation because it's a very specific thing. You will find that in any sector. Talk about lawyers, for example. They are the custodians of the law. How many rogue lawyers are there? So in the church, we are saying there are places where we need to pull up our socks or put them on. Because there are people, we will have to accept that there are churches that start, and sometimes purely out of ignorance. I have had pastors who come to my office who are not members of our denomination. But they just come and say, Bishop, I am a leader of our church. Our church has grown tremendously. I do not know how to put in structures and systems that would help us to run in an organized manner. What tips can you give me? And I have had the joy of helping these kinds of people to actually put in place systems and structures that can help them. And it gives me the impression that there are many people out there who are doing the wrong thing, not because they want to do the wrong thing, but sometimes purely out of ignorance, they don't know how any better. So really, as a church body corporate, as the body of Christ, we need to develop systems through which we can help one another, even those independents who are not under any umbrella organization, that we can help one another, not through condemnation, but rather through empowerment. In the kind of conference that we have organized here, maybe at a lower level, that we can go out there and train people. How do you organize your church? How do you put in governance structures that can help you to run your church in a better way? I think we can help very, very many people who are willing to do the right thing, but just don't know how to do it.
And that is where we start to seek solutions, which is to find those that may not be there and may not be part of NCCK Evangelical Alliance or the Anglican Church. So what would it take then? Because I want us to close the discussion, and I think I'll start with you, Archbishop Sapit. What is the one thing that we can take away as a commitment here from you today that will be different? Drastic times call for drastic measures. And indeed, we grew up with Reverend Timothy Njoya, Archbishop Gitari, Ndingi Mwananzeki. All of these were, very powerful names and very powerful voices. I mean, when they came and said, from today, this is what we're going to do, forget even in political life, but even just in guidance of day-to-day Christian living, I mean, people listened. So certainly, these are not ordinary times. So from you, one thing that we can all be testament to here today, and not to condemn, but to start to walk with you as we go along.
I think you almost got us wrong when you said all is well, and we did not say everything is well in the church. And we admitted that there are shortcomings, which are things that must be worked on. So there is a whole huge importance of this gathering and this training, this session. So they did not come visit us in vain to speak to us. But I think one thing we need to do is that the church has structures. When we use our structures well, for example, in the Anglican Church of Kenya, we have, I don't make decisions alone, I have the House of Bishops. Important decision, we have to communicate through the House of Bishops. We do write guidance letters that congregations will follow and dioceses will follow. And therefore, we will use our structures. One thing we must also accept is that the church, as I said, is not one just independent body. We call it church out there, but you know there are many church denominations and institutions that are so independent. Even in one denomination like the Anglican Church, we still say for people to have freedom of doing things that are so dear to them, we have autonomy of dioceses. I don't make decisions for every single diocese, but we give guidance. And therefore, I'm saying we can use our structures, identify those things that will make the church church, and see where the boundaries I talked about have collapsed, and say, can we put our boundaries right so that what is church is done the way the church expects. And one of the things that we also talking about is a constitutional framework. Every church and those who do not have strong constitution need to have their own ways of dealing with their own internal mechanisms. This year, for the Anglican Church, we have earmarked as our year of governance. So when this was organized, it resonated well with our year of governance. And we are not only talking to the government about good governance, we are saying how do we interrogate our own systems, check our policies. And that's why we are doing from January to December, and say by December, we have set in motion and in place things that we will be comfortable. This will help the Anglican Church of Kenya to govern herself and to guide the flock. Thank you.
Canon Karanja, I know you've been speaking quite a bit on what's happening politically, and I know there's been work behind the scenes. What can you do at NCCK to be that moral example that has the moral authority to speak to matters of national life in Kenya? Perhaps it can be one that you would do very differently from what you have been doing, because I think that would be the purpose of a governance summit such as this, to say we're doing something, one thing significantly different.
Thank you very much. First to say, the reason we are here is not because the church has failed. The reason we are here is because we are church, and it is recognized. The church, even at its weakest in Kenya, is still the one most potential social transformation agency that must be called upon to rise to the occasion, and it must examine itself and ask, what does it need to do to optimize itself? If you ask me what is it that I think ought to be done in Kenya by the church and NCCK to address the current challenges that the country faces, I would say Kenyans need to talk with one another. And I think the most critical thing for me, our communities must engage in rigorous intra-ethnic dialogue and conversations in order to understand themselves before they can seek to engage beyond themselves. It is imperative that once they understand their situations, they must examine how they engage inter-ethnically with others. I think Kenyans are not talking enough. I think they're trying to run away from the moral responsibility of entering into genuine, authentic conversation for Kenyans to determine how we shall live together as a nation. I don't think there is a way around that. It must happen continually, but now it must happen critically. At NCCK, every day engages very often discreetly in trying to nurture that kind of engagement. And you know, we are very public at great costs.
Okay. Very public at great cost. I know the media will come into sharp focus there. Bishop, can that dialogue start within the church, and that then just forms, that escalates to the nation? Is it perhaps that people don't think it's happening within the church? Remember, it's a matter of perception, and perception is key.
I think, as Canon Karanja said, Kenyans need to talk, and talk candidly. One of the challenges we have, and I would say as Africans, is that we do not like direct talk. You know, if something is wrong with you, I'll tell stories around, hoping that you will learn that I'm actually saying something about you, you know. And so that's how we go about our business. And it doesn't get us to where we can solve or sort out our problems. Electoral problems have not started last year, 2016. We have had these challenges way, as far as I remember, you know, I was too young perhaps, but in the 80s, you know, you remember the Mlolongo issues and so on. And they have continued consistently every election. Now it's getting worse because more of the country is enlightened. In those days, only a small elite was. Now, a bigger proportion of the country is getting more enlightened, demanding rights, demanding things to be done in the right way, and so on. And that makes it the harder for us to continue playing games the way we used to play them. And if we do not talk, if we do not sit down and sort out these issues, intelligent fighting is worse than for those people who are ignorant. And so we will get to that place where society is much, much more informed. They know their rights. They know how things ought to be done. They are seeing it is not being done, and we will kill one another. In fact, we will annihilate one another. That is something that we do not want to confront, especially our leaders. And we who are ordinary members or citizens of this country, we rally blindly behind our leaders.
So how do we get that in the church? How do we start that conversation amongst the congregation?
We need to help our members to come to the realization that we are not sitting pretty. The fact, for example, that things are moving okay, everything seems to be going all right, does not necessarily mean that we are okay. I give the example of David, King David in the Bible, because these things didn't start today. King David in the Bible has a family. One of his sons is infatuated with a stepsister, and wants to get her to sleep with her. Tricks her to bring him food in the room, gets hold of her and rapes her. She cries. The matter is reported to David. David simply says, "Oh, how sad." He does nothing about it. The brothers are very angry at what has happened, and they see their father has not done anything about what has happened to their sister. 2 years pass by. They trick their brother to go out in the field, get onto him, and kill him for doing what he did. What was the problem? Because the father failed to deal with that issue of injustice that had been meted against his own daughter. And the stepbrother took it very seriously. And that is where, in my view, we are headed. Some of us are very happy right now that the elections came, elections are gone, let's proceed. Some people are so angry elections didn't even take place as far as they are concerned. We have these two groups who are fighting internally. Some people just seething with pain, others very happy. When it gets to that place where they have opportunity to take their brothers to the field, they will kill them. We saw it in 2008. So I'm saying we need to help our members to accept that we are not at a good place. Let's get to a place where we can vent these things.
Okay.
And
let me ask this.
Yes, ask.
Can we have some example of dialogue that's happening within our congregations?
Let me give you an example.
To help heal that chasm that then forms a template that can be escalated and that can be extrapolated, on a larger scale. I mean, it's one thing to say we're asking the leaders to come and talk, but like you've rightly said, it's the people that might be having issues with each other. can we commit here to say NCCK, Evangelical Alliance, the Anglican Church, we will set up some sort of dialogues,
groups
in our churches? Like, is that something we can commit to?
Yeah, I think one thing that we are not yet even have come to terms as Kenyans, we have been talking about dialogue, we have been talking about conversation. Looking at the political arena, they are talking at different wavelengths. To one group, dialogue must be around electoral justice. To one group, dialogue must be around development, that we have to conclude this chapter, we move on. In my view, I think the dialogue and the conversation the church and all of us need to begin is to begin by asking Kenyans to talk about what makes us fight every 5 years during an election year. Because this is not the first time we are fighting. We fought in 2007. Every election year in this country is a competition that leads us to killing one another. It is becoming a death trap. We must open conversations that Kenyans say, what is wrong with that moment when we are looking for leaders? Is it about exclusion and inclusion? Is it about economic? What is it? The day we shall be able to open a conversation that Kenyans can sit down and say, what is problem? Is it my ethnicity? What is it? The day we shall discover, we shall be able to get into a discussion and a conversation that will enable us say, this is what is wrong with Kenyans, and because this is what is wrong, that's why we fight every election. Can we look for a political arrangement in future that will enable us, all of us, to feel we belong to Kenya, even when we go to elections?
Okay. Canon, is it a political solution, or is it more of our morals and our values and our ethics? Perhaps if we sorted that out, then whether we have an election or not, we have our moral compass in the right direction. As we close, I know we really need to close our conversation.
Certainly, a moral and spiritual engagement will help Kenya a great deal. But this is a democracy. 42 tribes initially and a few more now have bound themselves by a constitution and a system of government to manage their public affairs in a certain way that makes them very angry when they're outside and a bit evasive when they are inside. That is not sustainable. I think there is no shortcut. Outside Kenyans engaging and genuinely examining the national process and asking what works for us. Now, you know that there are many initiatives that are engaged, but this cannot be achieved unilaterally by anyone. It will require a genuine bipartisan approach with a commitment by all Kenyans, possibly driven by people who are not the major political players, so that Kenyans can have a conversation. It's a matter of when, not whether, and I would persuade our leaders to hasten it so that Kenyans come together quickly and talk. At NCCK, you saw we issued a statement last week. I gathered together about 110 leaders of the church from across the country, bringing all tribes together, and we spent 2 days asking, where is Kenya? What message do Kenyans need to get now? And we issued a statement that has generated as much support as flack, depending on what sides people are in the national debate. In the coming weeks, we are rolling out in all our 9 regions this conversation, and we want to take it to the communities as an attempt of creating a groundswell from the grassroots that create a conducive environment for Kenyans to talk and appreciate no community can isolate itself and achieve its interests at the expense of other tribes without looking after their interests as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bishop Dr. David Oginde, Canon Peter Karanja, Archbishop Sapit. I thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Hopefully one day there will be a woman sitting here. That is my hope and my prayer, actually, that one day there will be a woman at the helm of at the helm of the leadership of the church in the country.
Our chair is a woman.
Yes, indeed.
She's just in the US, she'll be here.
Oh, okay, so you are here representing her. Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I thank you, and I thank you all for your time. And thank you for this. Hopefully this is a conversation we'll continue to have. Thank you.
Hesabika, translating concern into action.
What is it that we can learn in Kenya from King 4 that would begin to change our governance principles and codes for Kenya? So that is why it's so important that King is here. But there's something that he said in the meeting today that stunned everyone. Because you see, in this country, if you really want to get some quick money, you go into these days public service. You know, that's where you get these huge allowances for sitting in committees and in tenders and that kind of thing. He has worked for the government of South Africa from maybe even earlier. And he says that he's never taken a cent, even for photocopying. They do it free of charge from their pockets. Now, to tell that to Kenyans was a huge revelation. And so, I mean, that is only one anecdote that we could share about him. And without spending any more time, so that you are not here the whole night just listening to the introduction, we are very, very glad to welcome, to greet you briefly, retired Justice Professor Mervyn King, to come and share with us very, very briefly what is it and what are some of the principles that we could use for church governance here in Kenya. Put your hands together and welcome Professor Mervyn King.
Good evening. I am an African. I don't look like an African, but I'm an African. I was born in South Africa. I was educated in Zimbabwe and went to university in South Africa. And I'm now a person of the world. I travel all over the world. I'm chairman of a world body. And it's interesting that an African from the tip of our continent chairs the world body on corporate thinking and corporate reporting. So let me just go back to the middle of the 19th century. So I'm going to repeat something I said this morning. I don't agree with Dr. Schluter that the church can always oppose something and Parliament will not agree. Because what happened in the United Kingdom in the middle of the 19th century is that the government of the day, representing society, decided to pass a bill to create an artificial person with limited liability, the company as we know it today. Theologians were opposed to it. Famous theologian Lord Thurlow, you can Google it, Thurlow, 1844, said only Almighty God can create a person. Man cannot create a person. It hasn't got a body to be kicked, a soul to be damned, and hasn't got a conscience. And the theologian was correct. If you register a company today, here in Kenya, it has no body to be kicked, no soul to be damned, nor a conscience. It's an inanimate, incapacitated person. Now, if you have an 18-year-old brother that got injured in a motor car accident here today in Nairobi, and you went to the hospital, heaven forbid, and the physician specialist told you and members of your family, I'm afraid this young man is physically very fit, he'll easily live into his 90s, but I'm afraid he's mentally incapacitated and you'll have to look after him for the rest of his natural life. And your family asks you to look after him for the rest of his natural life. It wouldn't enter the head of any Christian in this room to filch for him or herself some benefit out of this unfortunate human being's circumstances. You would be loyal to him. You would take great care of his assets and take great care that you made a decision in his best interests. Whatever skills you have, you would apply to him voluntarily. You would be diligent in your homework and plan for him short, medium, and long term. And that's exactly how the duties of directors develop for companies. Because the company is an incapacitated artificial person which has no heart, mind, or soul of its own, and the directors become the heart, mind, and soul of the company. But what happened in the 19th century into the 20th century, right till the end, until the turn of the 21st century, is that companies were run on a basis of maximization of wealth, profit, at any cost. And it was at a cost. It was at a cost to society and the environment. Just look around the planet, anywhere. You can go anywhere in the world. You will see pollution resulting from 20th century expansion, corporate expansion at a cost to society and the environment. We have the largest landfill in the world is not even on land. It's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean where the currents have caught the plastic bottles that are non-degradable, plastic packets, old tires, old buckets, and has created a mess of plastic waste larger than the size of Texas in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We have 7 dead oceans, 7 dead areas in our oceans where the life under the sea can't live anymore because of the nitrates on chemical nitrates on farms to speed up agricultural growth for the population explosion of the 20th century is washed down from rivers into the sea. So we actually have what a PhD student said to me many years ago. Dr. Schluter spoke about the people who come after us inheriting fiscal debt. When I spoke about the global financial crisis in 2008 at the Frankfurt Business School, a PhD student said to me, "Professor, the fiscal problems are not a problem of the new generation. It's the global environmental crunch which you and your generation created for us that we have to try and correct." And he was right. It's easy to fix fiscal problems compared with trying to rehabilitate planet Earth, to get it back to the state in which we inherited it. Talking about Christian values, it's a moral and economic imperative, and also a Christian thing, to leave the planet in a state not worse than we found it when we were created by Almighty God and put on this earth. We have a duty as transient caretakers. None of us own this planet. We might have title to a piece of ground, but we don't own it forever. It's passed on. We are transient in this world, and we have to make sure that we try and leave it in as good a condition as we found it. Hopefully, we'll try and improve it. It's the correct thing to do. And that also is a Christian thing to do. The other interesting thing about talking about Christian values, what did Christ teach us? He taught us to treat people equally. But what did we do in the business world? We actually gave primary of place to one stakeholder, the shareholder. We didn't until integrated thinking and integrated reporting came along towards the end of the 20th century and just into the 21st century. The integrated thinking being to give parity of thought to every stakeholder in the company, the employee, the service provider, the provider of goods. Know and learn of their relationships, their needs, interests, and expectations of the company. And with that understanding, making a decision in the best interest of that company, its long-term health, not the maximization of wealth. And if we as directors get that right, it's the right Christian thing to do to assure the long-term health of the company, which is the long-term better interests of all stakeholders, and hopefully will leave the world in at least not a worse state than it is at the moment. And that we owe a Christian duty to those that come after us. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Hesabika, translating concern into action.